Like a storm out of the east, please welcome the inimitable Rhydian Morgan to talk about argumentation.
Okay, now, like most of the lectures I do, I start off by describing what argumentation isn't. Because I think very often when you're trying to define something, one of the most natural things to do as a human is to define things by what they're not. To define things by their other, if you like. A good example of that is if you try and define the concept of right without ever using the word wrong, how easy is that?
Not very easy.
Or a concept of right if you don't mention left. It's almost impossible, isn't it? So we automatically define things by their opposites. We define cold by a lack of heat. We define darkness by a lack of light. So let's start off with, we're going to talk about argumentation. That's a good start. Yesterday was a very long day, as you can. What is argumentation not?
It's not agreeing with your opposition.
Not agreeing. That's part of it. Certainly, you want to be creating clash.
That means it's not just a rhetorical exercise.
Hmm?
It's not just rhetorics.
Yeah, it's not just rhetorics. What else is it not?
Just bluffing, laughing.
Yeah. It's also not shopping lists. What do I mean by shopping lists?
Just making few things I have in mind without any links between them.
Absolutely. People sometimes think that the more examples they give, the better their argument. That, if you think about it, is quite absurd. Because if we're dealing with general principles, there are hundreds, maybe thousands, potentially millions of different examples that we can use. If that's true, just listing those examples doesn't prove our case in any way, does it? Come in and don't worry about it, because I made exactly the same mistake. Okay? As I said, the first lesson we can all learn from today is just because things have always happened a certain way in the past, doesn't mean they'll always happen a certain way in the future. That's actually a good lesson for debate in general. You know, every time we have done X, then Y has happened. Doesn't necessarily follow that Y will always happen. Certain conditions must prevail. And also, we should all read the schedule for the next day. Because it's most embarrassing if I don't have it. We're talking about argumentation. And I said right at the beginning that one of the easiest ways to define anything is to define things by what they're not rather than what they are. Like if you want to define a concept of right-handedness, you can't do it if you don't talk about left. It's almost impossible to understand what the right means if you don't talk about the left. So argumentation is not agreeing with your partner, it's creating clash. When we say not agreeing, that doesn't just mean if you're the opposition. It means giving something if you're the proposition that can actually be opposed. There's a really good example of that from a World Schools Championship of just a few years ago. The motion was, and this shows just how quickly debate motions go out of date. The motion was, this House believes Gorbachev's reforms will fail.
Well,
Anybody remember who Gorbachev was?
yeah.
Yeah. Anybody remember his two major policies?
Perestroika.
And
Glasnost.
Glasnost, absolutely. What is perestroika?
It's
Yeah, it's three-part reform. Anything that has a troika is going to have three elements to it. It's three-part reform. And glasnost, what does glasnost mean? It's just more general openness. Openness is a principle. Don't worry about it, I made the same mistake.
Oh, okay.
It's okay, nobody gets shouted at for being. In fact, you're all 5 minutes early according to my internal clocks.
Yes.
But no, the lesson for next time, guys, read the schedule carefully because even I assumed that it was 1:30.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do the whole Ferris Bueller thing about never assume because. Why should you never assume anything?
Make an ass of you anyway.
There you go. You assume and you make an ass of you and me.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so in this debate, this House believes that Gorbachev's reforms will fail. Or the case division that the side arguing the proposition chose, the first speaker stood up and described what Gorbachev's reforms were. And that was all they did. Then the second speaker stood up and said, there is a huge backlash against these reforms. And then the third speaker came in with the argument that because there was such a huge backlash, that meant the reforms were doomed to fail. So what objection was there to the first speaker?
None.
Absolutely nothing. All he'd done was state facts that couldn't be argued against. Was there anything that could be clashed with the second speaker?
No.
No, because everybody accepted that there was a backlash. The only argument came from the final speaker when he stood up and said, and that's why the reforms will fail. And then, so you got through 4/5 of a debate before anybody actually started having a debate. Until then, it was just a kind of, this is a fact. Yes, it is. Here is another fact. Well, funnily enough, we agree with that one as well. You know, you don't create a debate if you don't have proper argumentation. So not agreeing goes for both sides. You have to be able to create clash. It's not just rhetoric. It's not, flowery, pompous language. Sometimes that can backfire really badly. Another great example was when I saw somebody giving a point of information. And they decided, to practice their oratory at the same time. And they turned to the judges and they went, I may be particularly dense. And the speaker went, yes, you are, and that's it. And there was an opportunity completely wasted to tackle them on an argument because they wanted to show off their oratory and their pompous rhetoric. Okay? Argumentation is not bluffing. Why is bluffing not argumentation?
The argument should be derived from certain elements. I am something other.
Yeah. Arguments should come from somewhere. Anybody can spin a tale. Hopefully. You should all be capable of telling a story. But that's not what we're trying to do. And the last thing that it's not is shopping lists of facts. You can give me all the factual evidence in the world, but statistics in and of themselves prove absolutely nothing. Okay? It's a great quote from Benjamin Disraeli, one of the finest prime ministers of Great Britain. Does anybody know it? It's about statistics. There are lies, there are damned lies, and there are statistics. Okay? You can make statistics prove absolutely anything, depending on how you read them, and also depending on how you gather them. And I recommend, if you've got internet access in your room, go on YouTube and search Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister. It's a British TV show. And you'll find a clip there where a guy shows you how if you ask 5 questions in a different order, you can get people to be either pro or anti-nuclear deterrence. Just depending on how you ask the questions. So you start off by saying, do you think that countries with rogue leaders pose a threat to our security? Most people will say yes. And you build on that series of questions until they have no option but to say, therefore we need to maintain an independent nuclear deterrent. Or you could start by saying, do you think the world is safer now than it was during the Cold War? Yes. Most people would agree that there is far less threat of nuclear war right now than there was in the middle of the 1980s when we had Star Wars programs and things like that. And you build on that series of questions, and the ultimate conclusion is they can't say, that's why we need an independent nuclear deterrent, because they've argued themselves into a certain position. So be aware of shopping lists and statistics. Okay, so if that's what argumentation isn't, can we now start to define what it is? What do we need to make an argument?
Some facts.
Some facts. Some facts would be good. Let's see if we can draw up sort of a recipe for an argument, like a cooking recipe.
An idea that can be argued?
An idea. In what sense, an idea?
I know what I want to prove with those facts, and I link them logically, so it will support my general idea.
Okay. So a philosophical position, perhaps. A stance that you want to take. Your basic idea is going to be the stance, the position that you take in the debate. That's a great place to start with an argument. If you know what you are trying to prove in principle, then everything else should naturally follow from that. And you should always be able to test the validity of parts of your argument based on how far it goes to proving that initial premise. Let's think of an example. I did bring some with me. Hang on. Does anybody else find it ridiculously warm in here today? Good. I was worried it was just me again. Okay, let's suppose, hypothetically, you've got the motion. You know the difference between principled and practical motions, right? This house believes,
This house would.
and this house would. This house believes is just asking you to affirm or deny a proposition. This house would is asking you to implement a policy to do something. So that's when something's either a policy or a principled debate. But the argumentation that goes with either is pretty much the same. The only thing that changes is the fact that one has a model that says how you are going to achieve something. But that's not the major thrust of your argument. You don't want to get into a debate about that's not the right way to do it. Because if all the opposition are going to stand up and say, we can think of a different way to do it, then they've conceded all the principle. And there's still principle to be argued in a policy debate. Think of the motion. This house believes that we are all feminists now. How do you prove or affirm that idea? So the stance that we're taking is that the battle of the sexes has been won. We are all feminists. Okay? How does proposition go about affirming that motion? Yeah.
Look at like societal trends based like a long time ago and do it relative to now and see how far we come.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you can do this if you want. You can do your shopping list. You can give numerous examples of where we respect equal rights for women, equal pay, and things like that. Or, as you said, you can look at major trends within society. So you could look at, for example, media, and talk about the media's attitude to women and how that's changed. Now, if you show that the media's attitude to women has changed, does that prove the case that we are all feminists?
No.
What else do you have to show in that media argument?
You have to show that not only it's changed, but it's changed in a direction that promotes women.
That's partly it, but further than that.
The media's influenced
Media
our
are
ideas.
influencing
say it.
masses.
The media's influenced our ideas.
Yeah, medias are influencing masses. That
Yeah.
means that when media change opinion, it means the whole mass.
Yeah, it's one thing to show that media opinion has changed, and that's the first part of it. You've then got to show that the media is so fundamental to our societal outlook that when media changes, we change. If you don't do that second bit, all you've done is give an example of something that has adopted a more feminist outlook. What about if you talk about religion?
that the religion is fundamental in shaping people's opinions?
Absolutely. You can show that certain religions have changed to adopt a more egalitarian point of view with regards to women. I think it might be harder than doing it with the media, given that you're going to come up against things like fundamentalist Islam, the Catholic Church. Lots of religions seem to have a right to discriminate where people who aren't religious don't. For example, public bodies aren't allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. The Catholic Church still is. That might be an anomaly, but you've still got to show the same relation between media and society as between religion and society, okay? If you want to attack that argument, do you do it by lots of examples where the media hasn't changed?
No, I do it.
You might want to say that by using those as sort of parts of a much bigger argument. Like that's not like the whole argument, but it's pieces of a much bigger argument.
Yeah. If you just pick on, let's say religion, because that's the easier one to attack, obviously. If you just say, well, I can give you lots of examples where religion doesn't treat women in the same way, all you've done is show that religion was probably a bad example. But it hasn't attacked the central premise of the government's case. You can give lots of examples where religion hasn't done that, or you could say religion just isn't that central to the way society thinks and acts these days. It's pretty peripheral. It's only central for very religious people. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the wider society. So you can get rid of all the religion examples much more quickly. Okay? So we need facts. We need an idea, a philosophical stance. What else do we need?
Would a comparison be included in the part of a stance and how things have changed and developed, like evolved? Like a compare and contrast thing.
Yeah, compare and contrast. I think that's a good idea. And you need to be able to show contrast or similarities between certain things. But there's something that we need in between that and that and that and that and that and that.
Logic. Or some
Structure.
structure, strategy.
I'm looking for a word that begins with L.
Links.
Links. Absolutely. You need to show the link between the facts and the idea, or between the comparison and the idea. No point putting up lots of facts without showing how they link back to your central case, your team line. Remember we talked about that on day one. You need to have a clear team line that you can sum up in just one sentence, okay? So, for example, yesterday's motion, does anybody remember what it was?
Yeah, this house supports military intervention to deliver emergency aid during humanitarian crises.
Okay, so what is the government team line for humanitarian aid? Or what should it be? Now you've all had feedback on it. Okay, let's put a line down. That's go. That's all. What should the government team line be? Yes?
It should be that if you don't provide the humanitarian aid, people are going to die. They're going to be they're being oppressed by their dictators, or they're being oppressed by their government. We need to do something. This is a moral issue.
Come on,
Yeah,
human.
people are suffering. We need to try and make our team line as succinct as possible. So people are suffering.
And we must relieve their situation.
Because we're all humans.
Yeah.
And it's based on human.
Our team line is people are suffering. It is our duty. We have an obligation to prevent that from happening. Intervention will do this. So all the examples you want to give need to link back to that central idea. Okay? You need to say why going into Burma, going into Zimbabwe will be effective. Now that's a policy debate, really. You don't have to say exactly how many troops you're going to use and stuff like that. People always get bogged down in the detail of policy. And again, those debates become very, very niggly and very almost pointless, you know? Your job isn't to decide on the number of troops needed for a successful land invasion of Burma. We can leave that to the armed forces. We have specialists who do that. But you still need to link it back to, we can see that when we have gone into places to provide humanitarian aid, we've been able to alleviate the suffering. This is what we should always be trying to do by virtue of our own humanity. You're linking it back to your central case. What's the opposition central case? Or what could it be?
It could be that intervening militarily would violate international law.
Okay. Sovereignty. Because that's the big issue in international law. Countries' right to govern within their own borders and not have it interfere with them. What could the other team line be? Because you don't have to have just one. I mean, you have to have one within the team, but there are more than one possibilities. Yeah.
Intervention leads to more violence in specific countries.
Causing greater harm. Which of those is the better team line to take if you're given the moral obligation line over here?
The second one,
Why?
because it opposes and like rebuts the first one.
Yeah, there's more direct clash between those two, right? Does everybody see how that works? Sovereignty, great. Lovely, fluffy, woolly principle. Let's all go skipping through the bluebell singing, "Come my arm, my lord." But does it affect the fact that people are dying? No. Saying if you want to prevent suffering, you're going to cause more is a pretty effective line of opposition. And so you need to then build examples that link back to that case. And what would the examples be?
You could say that, you could cite, like in our case, we used the United States' intervention in Haiti in 1910. 15,000 people were killed, and America went in on the basis of humanitarian aid and repression. And 15,000 people were killed, and the United States was there for 3 years.
30 years.
Okay, that's an example of intervention going badly. Doesn't necessarily attack the principle directly.
No, you can go on and on with the examples forever.
Yeah.
Of successful and unsuccessful. It doesn't really help you to interpret.
No. So what do you need to do?
I need to prove that my side is right because I'm doing greater good by not going into the country.
Yeah. You need to show not just an example or not just some examples, but that in the vast majority of cases, a government will act in a certain way. Now, most of the time when you need to go into a country to enforce humanitarian aid, what kind of governments are you dealing with? Democracies?
No.
No.
Free and fair, liberal, happy, clappy people? No. Military juntas?
Yes.
Yes. Military juntas generally don't care about the welfare of people to begin with. Okay? So if you go in, you're going to have to go in with what?
Guns.
Force. You can't just send in the Red Cross or the Red Crescent, depending on where you are in the world, or Médecins Sans Frontières. You can't send in people armed with little vials of penicillin. You're going to have to send in an armed force at the same time. Okay? If you've got a government that already treats its people's welfare with disdain to the point of not wanting to help them when there's a humanitarian crisis, how are they likely to react to something like that?
Not very well. Not very
Violently.
Exactly. They're likely to react with violence. So you don't need necessarily a specific example that shows that. You might want to give one or two to show that There are practical examples of this happening, but they are examples that support your line of argumentation, that governments who don't care about their people will react badly to that kind of intervention. You don't need to show that they are going to put their people as a human shield, or that they're going to turn their guns on their own people, but you can show that their actions are likely to be geared towards preventing that aid getting through. Okay? That's the problem in Zimbabwe, that's the problem on the ground in Burma, that's the problem in China sometimes. It's not that we can't get the aid in, it's that we can't get the aid to the people who need it, because the state prevents us from doing so. Now that's an argument that stands without any specific example, unless it's properly rebutted by the other side. So that's what you're trying to do when you're developing argumentation. Okay. If you have an argument that you're trying to prove and there aren't any examples for it, or you can't think of any examples, you haven't been able to find any, how do you make your argumentation work?
Would I make a model? I mean, I can expect, so I can model this example.
Yeah. You can predict what would happen. That's what scientists do all the time. They build experiments to test hypotheses. So you can develop a hypothesis that certain things will follow from certain others, always being aware that just because certain things have followed in the past doesn't mean that those things will follow in the future. Things can always change. External factors will always have a certain amount of effect. But one of the best ways of developing an argument that's going to stand without recourse to examples is what? What are you trying to prove if you're not trying to prove facts? Values. Principles. Now, be very, very careful when you're arguing values and principles. Who here has ever heard anybody stand up in a debate and say, this is more democratic, therefore it's good?
It's not the universal value of democracy.
Very few values are universal. Very few values are. But even if it is good because it's more democratic, just saying more democratic equals good, is that a good argument?
No.
Really?
What's the missing bit?
Why is it good?
Why is more democratic more positive?
Yeah. Why is more democracy a good thing? What is it about democracy that we like so much that we want more of it? So who wants to tell me what's good about democracy?
Is it everyone has the right to speak freely? Everyone has the right to make their own decisions and to elect and to put the people that represent their best interests into positions of power.
Well, now you're getting into a type of democracy. That's a representation of democracy. But what's good about democracy?
Equal wars of people, everybody's chance. Equality is
What's good about equality?
Yeah, that's how you're going to say
yeah,
that.
it's not
If you're saying that one value is good because it helps us support another value, you're just shifting the argument down the line to you now got to say why equality is good. Is equality good?
Yeah.
Is it?
well,
So
Sometimes.
if somebody can't run the 100 meters as fast as me, maybe I should have lead weights on my legs so we all run the 100 meters in the same time, because that would be equal, right?
Then it would be a matter of equity. Or
Is equality good? What type of equality are we talking about?
Kurt Vonnegut.
Harrison Bergeron, good knowledge. It's a short story by a guy called Kurt Vonnegut. Some of you may have heard me mention him. Wrote a wonderful book called Slaughterhouse 5 about the bombing of Dresden by the Allies in 1944. He also wrote a short story called Harrison Bergeron. Harrison Bergeron lived in the most equal society in the world. So equal that everybody wore lead weights around their legs, so everybody ran the 100 meters in the same time. All the good-looking people were made to wear bags on their heads, so all the ugly people didn't feel self-conscious. All the intelligent people had huge speakers strapped to the sides of their heads. Discordant noise played every 15 seconds to disrupt any clever thoughts they might be having. Because, you know, it was unfair that some people were born more clever than others. But we all just said equality was good.
Only in some cases.
Ah, which cases?
Like as far as your rights go, but not as far as your
Who
abilities.
says who has more rights to be smarter than others?
Okay, when we talk about equality, and we do it a lot, what we're really talking about in liberal Western democracies is equality of opportunity. We can't legislate for the imbalances of nature. That's obviously a bad idea. Like you said, it is stupid. But it's often difficult to say just why. If just is never an argument. You know that that's not an argument in a debate. If you stand up and go, we're right because we just are you going to win that debate?
Yes.
No, you're not. Okay? You're clearly not going to win that debate. So you need to be able to show why even the most self-evident to you of arguments are true. Okay? Equality of opportunity, equality of treatment under the law. All these things are important because they prevent what in a democracy?
Oppression.
Oppression. Great phrase. Anybody know it? What's the danger of democracy? Democracy becomes, without protection, democracy becomes the tyranny of the majority. Just because 51% of the people say do something does not make it automatically the right thing to do. Okay? If 51% of the people in the US say kill all the ginger kids, that doesn't mean killing ginger kids is a good thing. It might be funny, but it's not good. Okay? Lots of places have enacted democratic laws that have violated other principles.
You know, democracy is based on the greatest possible good. The greatest possible majority of people satisfied, because you can never achieve 100%. You know.
Is
So-
it? Is it?
No, I don't think that you can ever achieve like any kind of government 100% satisfaction.
But is democracy just about making the greatest number happy? Or is a true democracy about protecting smaller groups within it? And that's why we have freedom of speech. Because by allowing even the smallest voice to speak out, we can better protect that voice. That might be why democracy is good, why it's better than dictatorship. Because dictatorship can still make 75% of the people happy, as long as you identify what those 75% want, and you know what? You're not the problem, the other 25% are. Rwanda operated along democratic principles when Hutus massacred Tutsis and vice versa, because the populations were shifting and whoever was dominant would then persecute the other one. I hope we can all agree that that wasn't a desirable state of affairs. Okay? So be careful when you're affirming what seem to be self-evident principles. Make sure you are able to argue that they should be affirmed. Democracy is important because that is why more democracy is good. Not more democracy is good because it is. Or that's stupid because it is. That's a slightly circular argument. If something is because it is, there's not much room for objection to that. You can't argue that it isn't. If something exists, you can't say it doesn't exist. Okay? So be careful. Values and principles are very, very important, but you need to be able to say why they're important. Why do we want to protect individuals' rights? Somebody tell me.
So that people have the freedom to make their own decisions.
But people make bad decisions. Why would I want to give them the freedom to do that?
Because it's I never really thought about this.
There you go. That's the answer I was actually looking for. Very few people have ever thought about this. We just grow up accepting that certain things will always be there and will always be good. And yet when we come to analyze why, we struggle. I can give you a very, very simple reason why protecting individuals' rights and individuals' voices is good. because you judge the morality of a system by the way it treats its worst elements. Okay?
Well, I think it's like,
We are all more human when we treat other people better. We are all dehumanized when we treat other people worse. It affects our own humanity. One of the great arguments in legal philosophy, and this follows on from this, how do you test whether a legal system is fair? Ask yourself one question. Would I be happy to be falsely accused? If you think about it, that's a pretty solid way of testing any legal system. Would I be happy to be falsely accused, arrested, put on trial? Do I think my chances of the truth coming out are good enough? In Zimbabwe, there's no way I'm happy to be falsely accused. Because I know that I'm going to get beaten by ZANU-PF thugs. In Britain, unless I'm falsely accused of terror crimes, and so they're going to lock me up for 42 days, apart from that, I'm pretty happy with the legal system we have. So democracy protects individuals' rights because we ourselves would want our rights protected even if we were in a minority of one. And it's very, very easy to extend from what you think is good for you to what should be good for everybody else. Look at the most basic laws we have. The law against murder. Is it possible to say that we think there should be a law against killing people because we ourselves wouldn't like to be killed?
Things like golden rule,
Do unto others as you would have done unto you.
That's all about
Yeah.
the legal system.
Absolutely. I don't want people infringing on my bodily integrity. Therefore, I think it's safe to affirm as a general principle that everybody's bodily integrity should be protected to a certain degree. And that's why different states come to different constructs of rights. Did we talk about the different construct of rights in the East and West? With some of you I did, didn't I?
Yes.
But some rights are not universal. Particularly in Eastern societies, Southeast Asian societies like Singapore, Korea, rights take on a much more societal meaning than an individual meaning. Because everybody has decided that, if they were in trouble, they would want the state to help them. So they assume that that's what's going to work for everybody. In the West, we have a much more individual construct of rights. Whether it works or not, it's up to you to decide. But whether or not you can argue the case is always absolutely clear. If we go back to the Gorbachev motion, I told you how the team did it. One team speaker set out what the reforms were, one speaker set out what the objections were, and the third speaker actually made an argument that supported the case. How could that have been done better by that team?
The other way around. The arguments first.
And then two speakers just saying what the reforms were? You've still got two speeches that are totally useless because they're not doing anything to further the debate.
If you take the first two speakers and put it in a succinct introduction that's in the first speech, and then start your argumentation in the middle of the first speech and have it go through all the way.
Well, what types of reforms were there under Gorbachev's leadership?
Well, they're quite unusual in governing time of the USSR because they were more towards democracy, so therefore they would be pleasant towards the people. I mean, there would be more general likeness towards them. Therefore, they are really good.
Okay, more specific question. Were there reforms regarding economic liberalism?
Yes.
Yeah. Were there reforms regarding the way the government operated in the Kremlin? Yeah. What about reforms in the military and the way that was structured? Yeah, no one. So you could have speaker one saying, I'm going to talk about the economic reforms, the backlash, and why those are doomed. Second speaker says, I can talk about government and military reforms. And then you've got arguments coming from both similar lines of argumentation, both supporting that single team case. But you see how the argumentation is what's important in both setting up and furthering the debate. If you don't have argument, you don't have a debate, do you? very, very hard to debate somebody who isn't making an argument. Like if I stand up and say, the world is round, is that a start of a debate?
No.
Only if somebody genuinely believes that it's not. And if they do, then I guess I'm probably going to win anyway. Having said that, I am a member of the Flat Earth Society. It's true.
Really?
Yeah.
You think
Not
that-
because I believe the Earth is flat at all.
Just for
Why?
fun?
Why?
I think it's important to challenge the prevailing orthodoxy of the time, no matter what that orthodoxy is.
Oh yeah.
That sounds like a Facebook group.
It's not, but maybe it should be. But no, I don't think the Earth is flat. But weirdly, neither did Christopher Columbus. You know that song, they all laughed at Christopher Columbus when he thought the Earth was round? Nobody laughed. The ancient Greeks knew the Earth was round.
Yeah.
It was a myth put forward in the Victorian era that people in the Middle Ages used to think the Earth was flat. Nobody did. Do you know who first came up with the theory that the Earth traveled around the sun and not vice versa?
Aristotle?
It was pre-Aristotle.
Plato?
He came after it.
Oh.
I know, yeah, but it was pre him as well. But it was the ancient Greeks. A lot of people think it was Copernicus.
Sorry.
Do you know when the Catholic Church accepted that that was true?
Have they?
1992.
Yeah.
1992, Pope John Paul II said maybe Copernicus was right. Maybe. We're going to qualify it with a conditional. But the argumentation that was made for it happening was the same right through from about 3000 BC. The argumentation against it was never really argument. What was the argumentation against the Earth traveling around the sun?
Is the importance of the sun travel time?
Now, the argumentation against it was that God wouldn't have put the Earth anywhere other than the center. Which is not a great argument in favor of something, is it?
No.
But is it an easy argument to overcome?
Not really, because talking of God, we just saw evident to
Absolutely. Which brings us on to the next element of argumentation. Faith-based versus reason-based argument. Okay, what do I mean by faith-based arguments?
Not based on factual information.
rather untruth.
Well, they might be based on I want to leave the word factual aside because
Not based on
Less
empirical experience, I would say.
they might be based on empirical experience.
Is it?
See, all these things are problematical in terms of the way we're phrasing them. Because if I'm a particularly religious person, my empirical experience of things may be colored by what I see as religious experience. So faith-based arguments.
Basically on your beliefs, not on logic.
I was gonna say that a faith-based argument might be I know this is true, as opposed to here is some evidence to say why this is true.
It's not so much whether I know it's true.
I was taught it's true.
It's not about me. Who's it about?
I believe.
Everyone knows it's true.
About the higher authority.
It's about everybody else. If you make a faith-based argument, the only way people can agree with that argument is if they believe the same things you believe. Now that can still be based on what I consider to be empirical evidence. I can consider the Word of God to be empirical evidence for me. But unless my audience all consider it the same way, I can never convince them of my position. Okay? Everybody understand that? That if you get people from two different religions, they're more likely to agree on a faith-based argument than somebody who's agnostic or atheistic. Because they make the same leaps of faith. There's a reason it's called faith. So faith-based arguments are things like democracy is good because it is. Lots of people believe that without ever working out why. Faith-based arguments lack argumentation. They are statements of belief. statements of belief. Reason-based arguments are arguments that can be proved logically. There's still an element of belief in them. You still start sometimes from a basic assumption, okay? But then your argument flows logically from that basic assumption. In the faith-based argument, you start from a basic assumption, you leap to another basic assumption without ever going over the stepping stones in between. And that's the important bit. But assumptions are very, very bad. I'll give you another example from world schools. The USA debated Pakistan in a motion about the Middle East. The USA team was in proposition, the Pakistan team was in opposition. And it was about how to solve the Middle East crisis. That was probably a bad motion in the first place for the organizers to set, given the international nature of the competition. But what assumption are the USA team likely to make that the Pakistan team won't necessarily agree with it ever?
Do you want to know that there is a crisis and that there is a crisis?
Oh no, I think everybody agrees there is a crisis. I don't think that's an issue.
Like, about like the role of Islam.
No?
I would say that they would like to solve it in democratical ways, and there's a question whether it's possible for a country.
More basic assumption than that.
The existence of Israel.
Absolutely right. Gold star. The USA team is never going to stand up and feel the need to prove, first and foremost, that Israel has a right to exist. Okay? The Pakistan team is always going to need that argued. They're always going to challenge that basic assumption because of the way they're taught. And that's not to say that Pakistan is taught badly. It's just a different culture and a different cultural perspective. Malaysia doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. When we had the World University Championships in Multimedia University just outside Kuala Lumpur, in a place, in a town that, funnily enough, you can tell where it comes from. It's called Cyberjaya, Cybertown in Malaysia. It's this whole city they created out of new technology, and it's absolutely fantastic. The Israeli debaters couldn't get visas because Malaysia doesn't recognize Israel as a country. There's no Malaysian embassy in Israel. If you're an Israeli debater, are you going to be happy sending your passport to Egypt and hoping it's going to come back?
No.
And even if you get a visa, you're going to get travel insurance, going to a country that doesn't think you have a right to exist in principle. So in that debate, even though most of the arguments are reason-based arguments, the basic assumption, Israel's right or not to exist, was an area of fundamental clash in the debate. It's still something that needs to be argued. Does Israel have a right to exist?
Of course.
Of course.
No.
That's an interesting way of saying it.
Stole land from the Palestinians and, well, originally it was land that the British had, so really this whole mess is the British's fault. Yeah, but that doesn't
Hang on,
change
hang
the
on.
fact
You're
that
talking
it's
about the
stolen.
practicalities of the creation of Israel where it is. We're talking about Israel's principal right to exist as a nation.
Playing devil's advocate here, no, it doesn't have a right to exist because Israel has existed for the last 60 years, but biblical times, that's like 5,000 years ago. Jewish people have not lived there for the past 5,000 years. It's been arid for the majority of
They
it.
were expelled.
That might or might not be a
I mean,
position
I believe
hang
it has
on,
a right
hang
to
on.
exist. But
That might or might not be a position we agree with. But there is an argument that can be made, as was made, that maybe it doesn't. I think you can also make the argument that yes, it does, because the rest of the world during and following World War II abdicated their moral responsibility to look after the Jewish populations of Europe. We had no other moral alternative than to create a homeland that was a safe haven for Jewish people. Now, whether or not I think Israel should exist, I can make either argument. Sometimes in a debate, you are going to have to make arguments that you might not be comfortable with, okay? Don't shy away from making those arguments, and making those arguments step by step. Very often it will become easier for you to make those arguments that you don't necessarily agree with if you go through the logical steps, okay? So think about building arguments, constructing arguments. How do you build a building?
You put a foundation.
Foundation. What's your foundation in argumentation?
Basic assumption.
There you go. It's your stance, your physical stance. Philosophical, not physical stance, sorry. Okay? That's the first thing you are going to have to identify in order to create any edifice of any strength. You then are going to talk about the values, principles that help you achieve that stance. So if your stance is people are suffering and they shouldn't, what are the values and principles that help you achieve that stance? Things like human rights pertaining on the basis of humanity, not on the basis of skin color or belief in democracy or anything like that. Then, you can start having your examples. And you have a nice pyramidical structure. Everything is underpinned by your philosophical stance. It's very, very strong. If you want to rebut argumentation, you still need to follow the principles of argument. What's the best way to rebut an argument that's built on a philosophical stance? Yeah.
Take the other stance.
Take that out. What happens if you knock out the foundations of a building? Everything else falls. If you spend all your time swinging your wrecking ball at this, you're still going to have a pretty strong building down here. Okay? And so many teams do that in their argumentation. They spend so much time arguing the examples. I don't care about examples that much in a debate. You know? I can think of tons of examples for and against something. For every example you give me that proves a case, I can give you an example that disproves it. It's the statistics game. We can prove anything, provided we pick the right things. But if you knock out the foundations, show us that the philosophical stance itself might not be desirable, or that there is a competing philosophical stance that we should be looking at, you can then, in opposition, build your own substantive case. Some oppositions don't do that. They don't feel the need to do that. All they do is rebut what the government has given them. How effective is that?
Not really.
Why not?
Do you want to answer?
Yeah, because I'm now making my point. I'm just rebutting something, but not swaying the opinion towards something. I'm my stand because I'm not presenting that.
Yeah.
As if the opposition were just depending on what the other side has to say. Well, I know it depends, but just like depending completely on what the other has got to say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're on much stronger ground as an opposition if you are prepared to build your case in opposition rather than just swing a wrecking ball. Yes, you want to knock down. Has anybody ever played Total War on a computer where you get to be like Rome or medieval forces or something like that?
I played Civilization, which is
Yeah, similar.
Or
You want to be knocking down the opponent's castle at the same time as building yours. You don't just send all your troops out to knock down the castle, do you?
Because then what happens is there's no troops left to defend your own.
Exactly. You've got nothing left to defend your own strategic position. Think of debate in those terms. Building something is always harder than knocking something down. If you've ever watched any buildings being demolished, How quickly does it last?
Couple of shape changes, but
Yeah.
done.
You take out the right keystones, the whole thing's gone in a couple of seconds. Building something that lasts takes an awful lot longer. But it's so much more worthwhile, both as an intellectual exercise and to give you a strong position in the debate. The judges will reward you far more for building an opposition case. Okay? The other thing is, be careful with motions that appear to be weighted to one side or the other. Judges very often might feel that a motion is weighted to one side or the other, and might be tempted, and this is a horrible thing that judges do, but yeah, we're all human, so we all make mistakes. We are tempted to give credit to people for having to argue a difficult thing and not doing it very, very well. And there's a good example of this, and all the examples I give you are genuine examples from past World Schools Championships. So a good example of this in the motion that this House would ban all alcoholic drinks. Now, who's that weighted in favor of? Proposition or opposition?
Opposition.
Why?
Because we already tried prohibition.
Exactly.
It didn't work.
Prohibition didn't
Totally.
work, did it? What happened during Prohibition?
People make alcoholic
Bootlegging drink.
Bootlegging, people made their own. So you got very dangerous forms of alcohol because you didn't have the checks and balances
Regulations.
on the substance itself. So things like moonshine can make you go blind, usually only for about 30 seconds. You'll get your eyesight back eventually. But it also promoted the rise of organized crime, certainly down the eastern seaboard. In the 1920s and 1930s, the gangs of New York and Chicago became incredibly powerful, running illegal whiskey in from Canada. So Prohibition didn't work. So in 3 different rooms, that motion was debated. This House would ban all alcoholic drinks. In room 1, the judges decided that the government had a really hard job. So decided to give them extra credit. Decided to read more into their argumentation because it was a hard argument to make. So in a close debate, they were going to give government the win over opposition because of that weighting. In room 2, the judges decided that they couldn't work out what the weighting should be, so they said it's not our job. We're going to leave that to the people who set the motion to sort out. In room 3, they did recognize that there was an unfairness to government, but they also said, well, government chose to be government in this room. So they picked the harder side to argue, so we're not going to give them any extra credit. What's the problem with that?
Bias.
Not bias. Begins with C. We want our judges to be
Descendant.
Consistent.
consistent. And you can't have consistency in that situation
Is that what it is?
because the judges in the first room who would give the win to government in a close debate, the other judges would have given the win in the same debate to the opposition. Okay? So if you think a motion is weighted against you, don't make too much of that fact. Still try and make your argumentation as logical and as simple as possible. Remember the very first lecture I gave when I talked about the importance of structure and taking that child by the hand as you walk through the woods so you've got clear signposts? Your structure helps your argumentation to develop. Okay? Like if you're going on a long journey, say you're driving all the way down the East Coast from, I don't know, New York to Florida. It's a long drive. Are you just going to head for the sign saying Miami?
No, you're
No.
gonna have to stop on the way, so
Yeah.
you can sleep.
You're going to have to work out places to go en route to Miami. So you're possibly going to go through, I don't know, Toledo, places in Ohio, depending on which route you go. But those little stepping stones are your logical steps in your argumentation. Okay? I want to prove to you that this point here is true, and I have to start over here. And if I do that in one great big leap, then I'm requiring you to have the same leap of faith as me. And even if judges do have the same leap of faith as you, even if you know that all your judges believe in the same particular branch of religion that you do, they're not going to judge you on that basis because they're told not to. We are told to leave our specific knowledge at the door. We're told to test whether an argument is good or bad, and whether or not an opposition rebuts it. That sometimes seems quite strange. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But we are told to judge things based on how they are argued. Okay? How do we judge the strength or weakness of an argument if the opposition never rebuts it? Can't we?
You can, because then.
If I say the earth is flat, does the opposition need to rebut the fact that the earth is flat in order for the judges to know that I'm making it up or that I'm wrong? Do they need specialist information? Do they need to have been to Earth is Round school? No. Would the ordinary, reasonably well-informed person, somebody who's prepared to pick up a newspaper now and again, know that that argument was a weak argument?
Yeah.
Well, that's what your judges are going to do too. If an argument is your major argument in your case, and it doesn't go rebutted, we're not going to give much credit to a weak argument, but we're also going to penalize an opposition on strategy for not attacking a major part of the case. If you give a weak example, and the opposition choose to ignore it to concentrate on other things, you're going to get penalized, but they're not. Okay? But you should always be thinking about, how does this further our overall position? How does this strengthen the position we said right at the very start of our very first speech? This is our team line. Who can tell me what their team line, not from yesterday's debate, from Friday's debate was? Was anybody really clear on a single team line on Friday?
No, I don't think so. We didn't position of our standards to the whole, but it was like more cultural clash than arguing whether 10 or the specific 12 is a good one.
Yeah. We had lots of examples in Friday's debate, certainly the room I judged. You had lots of examples where a 45-year-old marrying a 4-year-old might be a bad thing, which were all very, very true. But were also irrelevant if government never said, we think old men should be allowed to sleep with young children. Thankfully, government never tried to make that argument. So opposing an argument that isn't there doesn't further your position in the debate. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about, talking about argumentation, is talking about how, if you can't prove a particular case, how do you get a judge to believe it? Can you prove a principle?
No, it depends. It depends on what the principle is. If the principle is the earth is round, you can obviously prove that.
Is the earth is round a principle?
No, you can promote the principle as higher principle than the one proposition.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to try and show why, even if there is no definite answer to which principle, because some principles we think are good, and they will come into conflict. You can give me an example of two principles that we have almost enshrined in modern day society that conflict with each other. I've already mentioned it in this lecture.
Israel's right to exist.
No.
Democracy is good.
No. Two principles that conflict. That's what I'm looking for. I mentioned them both.
It's everywhere, especially in moral things like if you believe on abortion, the right to choose free and right to choose not. I mean, it's always true.
That's one. There's one that's much more fundamental.
You were saying, like, listen to the majority, but also listen to the minority?
No, I think you can have those two that will always conflict, that you can't uphold one and uphold the other at the same time.
The moral obligation to save lives and nation sovereignty?
No. In our society, whether that be the US or...
The thing where, like, the Catholic Church decided to be sexist?
Yes, exactly. We You have principle of equality of the sexes. In the battle of the century against freedom of religion. Almost every religion, to some degree, discriminates between the sexes. Religions are either patriarchal or matriarchal in terms of how you inherit them. Judaism is a matriarchal religion. It is passed on through the mother's line. If your father is Goyim, it doesn't matter. If your mother is a Jewess, you're a Jew. That's the way it works. In Islam, it's patriarchal. If your father is a Muslim, you are Muslim. Or you should be raised as Muslim according to the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran. What do you do if your mother's Jewish and your father's a Muslim? Say, I'm going to be a Jehovah's Witness.
You get to pick which religion that you want, you know.
But both religions would say that you don't get to pick.
You have a big war.
Yeah, you beat yourself up every time there's a conflict in Israel.
Every time you hear something about something going bad in Israel, you're both.
But you cannot have the secular principle of equality of the sexes and the secular principle, because don't forget, freedom of religion is not a religious value, is it? Which religion says it's okay to believe in other gods?
Paganism.
The first commandment, thou shalt have no other god but me. I think that kind of negates that position. Hmm?
Or Buddhism? They have a
Well, they have a pantheon of gods, but you're not allowed to worship gods outside that particular pantheon.
Paganism.
But again, they say which gods. There is no religion that says it's okay to be of a different religion. Because by definition, a religion, in order to be coherent and logical, has to be pretty absolutist about this thing. Either they're right or they're wrong. You know, there's no halfway house. You can't afford to be wishy-washy when you're writing a religious sacred text. And God might have said unto Abraham doesn't sound quite as convincing. Okay? So freedom of religion, by definition, is a secular value. It's something that can only exist in a secular democracy. The idea that people are free to practice whichever religion they choose. You can only have it if you have an element of separation of church and state. Or if you have an established church that is controlled by the secular state, as in the Church of England, where Parliament controls our church. And Parliament has decided that the secular value of freedom of religion is more important than making everybody Church of England. Which I like. That's kind of a nice stance. But it does conflict directly and every single time with the equality of the sexes argument. So, when you've got two principles, and you can't say, normally in a secular democracy, it's pretty easy to say, well, secular value always trumps religious value. That's why we're a secular democracy. That's an easy argument to make, isn't it? Because you can argue that all our other values stem from the secularity of the state. And you can show that those other values would have to go by the wayside if we didn't enforce that secularity. When the two values are themselves secular, which one of those should take primacy? Should we force religions to respect the equality of the sexes that we demand in a secular state?
Yes.
Or should we say, well, because we've said freedom of religion is a secular value, we then can't interfere with what they do?
But it wasn't even secular if it would include discrimination of sexes. You can attack its principle just based on and decline that
Yeah,
it's
but
secular.
if you attack the principle of religions, then you're denying the right of freedom of religion.
Yeah.
So you can't really pick one side or the
But
other.
what if you're
Exactly.
Yeah.
There is no right or wrong answer as to which will take primacy. So many of the laws where people go, whoa, that looks like a bit of a fudge. Guess what? It's a bit of a fudge. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Platypuses don't quack.
They let it.
Actually, no, hang on, it's not platypuses, is it? It's platypoides?
Yeah.
No, it's not platypi because it's not Latin, it's Greek. I think it's platypoides is the correct word.
But octopuses are octopi, right?
No, they're octopuses. Yeah. Again, it's Greek, not Latin. But they're not octopodes for some reason. My Greek isn't good enough to know why, but I will find out for you. I promise. Before you all go home, I'll find out the etymology of both platypus and octopus.
What about that whole rocket science thing you were going to tell us?
Oh, I'm still going to teach you rocket science, don't worry. We'll do that in the style lecture, okay?
Okay.
Remember that, I will teach you about rocket science in the style lecture. Okay, the thing about this is when you've got the clash of two secular values like this, it's almost impossible to say, well, this one is obviously the one we should promote. We would like to see both of them promoted as far as possible. The fudge we have drawn, particularly between these two, is where the religious organization exercises a public function, it then becomes an organ of the state and is bound by the purely secular value of the equality of the sexes. So, for example, religious schools are exercising a public function, so cannot then say we will only accept boys or girls if they are funded by public money. If they're privately funded by the money of the church, then we say, freedom of religion, do what you want.
But isn't there also like the separation of church and state so that public funded schools won't be teaching that
In
anyway?
the US, but we're talking about general principles that will apply, not just within certain nations' borders. That's the other thing. Every time you argue a principle, ask yourself, is this a principle that holds true everywhere? Or in the majority of places? It certainly won't hold true everywhere. But in the majority of places? Or is it something that I could only apply in my jurisdiction? Yes.
I have a question other way around. Then, as public schools exercising their role, publicly funded institution, do you have rights to deny the students to wear its religious symbols to keep it secular to them?
It's a very good question. There was a law passed in France that said you cannot wear religious symbols. The media reported it as a ban on the hijab, which is the Muslim headscarf that girls wear. There have been, to date, 9 prosecutions under that law in France. None of them involving Muslims. 2 of them involved Jewish boys who wanted to wear a Star of David. One wanted to wear a Star of David, one wanted to wear his yarmulke in class. The other 7 involved Catholic children who wanted to wear a crucifix. But that doesn't make good news in France. So you have to make the news about, oh, Muslims, because it sells more newspapers.
In Turkey, they're looking at the law to ban women to wear scarves in universities, and now they're trying to make the party illegal, the government party right now.
Girls
There is-
was wearing scarves, sorry, and there was this really public dissent about it because of the secularity of the Turkish state. So there's also this dispute over if the public person is still.
Yeah. It is in the Turkish constitution that if the government tries to pass laws making the country an Islamic, theocracy, the army has a constitutional obligation to overthrow that government. It's part of the Ataturk laws. It's Article 361 of the Turkish constitution.
How do you know that?
I spend a lot of time in Turkey. And Article 362 is you're not allowed to say anything criticizing Ataturk or the Ataturk reforms. And you can be thrown in prison for it. So you don't mention Armenian genocides. Or if somebody says Armenians, the correct response is, what Armenians? Okay? Okay, but the reason I've chosen examples like this is it's sometimes very, very difficult to say what argumentation is in the abstract. It's much easier to show you, or for you to show me, what constitutes a good or a bad argument. You can see for yourselves that when somebody stands up and says, you have to believe this because it's true, that's not very convincing. The preacher in the church is only usually convincing to people who already buy into that religion in some degree. It's very rare that the atheist walks into a church and is suddenly converted. You might shift from one denomination to another, but you've already made the leap of faith necessary to buy into some of the arguments made. Okay? With reason-based arguments, you should be able to show that even if you don't like the morality of the argument, the logic itself can't be faulted. Flawed logic in argumentation, always going to be bad, or lack of logic. Okay? Remember the three classical elements of rhetoric? What are they?
Logos.
Logos, pathos,
Ethos.
ethos. Logos is logic, pathos is what?
Emotions.
And ethos is
Credibility.
credibility or belief. Credos, also known as. Pathos and ethos are good for getting audiences on your side, getting people to like you or your argument. But it's logos that proves an argument as true in and of itself, as coherent. That's a great word for it. Coherence in an argument. If X, then Y. Has anybody here ever studied any pure logic?
Yeah.
So you've done things like P and not P?
Yeah.
P and not P, and everything else follows. Things are always either that or not that. Okay? If X, then Y. Be aware, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, be aware of syllogisms. What do I mean by a syllogism?
If something is black and some other element appears to be white, then if, for example, I say John, all cats are black, and John is black too, that means that John is okay.
Yeah. Socrates is a man. True?
Yeah.
True.
All men are mortal. True?
Yeah.
Therefore, Socrates is mortal. True?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Logical?
Yes.
Internally consistent, coherent, and true.
Yeah.
Okay. All cats have 4 legs and a tail. True?
No. False.
All cats that have not had a tail or a leg chopped off have 4 legs and a tail. True?
True.
My dog has 4 legs and a tail. True?
Sure.
Therefore, my dog is a cat. True?
No.
Where's the logical inconsistency between that and the Socrates argument?
reverse
Cat
is
to
true.
dog is from man to man.
The reverse isn't always true of the argument. If X
I
is-
started in the first one with the individual characteristic, then applied that characteristic generally to derive a truth at the end. Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Perfectly logically consistent and true. In the second example, I started with the general application of this characteristic and then found something that that characteristic could apply to. What is it about having 4 legs and a tail that defines that animal as a cat? Nothing. Lots of animals have 4 legs and a tail. So you can't derive the individual characteristic from the general application in the same way you can derive the general from the individual. Okay? So if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, it is necessarily true that Socrates is mortal. My cat has 4 legs and a tail, all dogs have 4 legs and a tail, doesn't matter, because it's not a condition of being a cat or a dog. So be aware of false logic. You will come across it in debates. And sometimes it will sound very convincing. So be aware of it, be able to pop that balloon when you see it. Okay, we're now going to have short prep. You've got just under an hour, you've got about 55 minutes, but that's not going to make much difference. Debate's going to start at 3:30. In 104, in here, AAA, that's you guys, right?
Yeah.
And the Yankees, which is, who are the Yankees? That's you two. Excellent. And in 119, by process of elimination, guys, I think you should have worked it out. Okay, AAA in proposition, Yankees in opposition. In 119, Churchill's in proposition, and Electric Pleasure Trio in opposition. Motion before the House this afternoon. This House would ban makeup in middle schools. Does anybody want any of that defining? Does anybody know what we mean by middle school?
6th through 9th, or 6th through 8th.
Oh, mine is 5th
Mine's
grade,
5th through
but-
Yeah, 5th through 8th.
But everybody has a concept of
Yeah.
what middle school is. You guys are okay with that? You guys who aren't from the US, you're familiar with the concept of middle school, all right? And the age range we're dealing
It's
with.
like ages 11 to 14 around.
Yeah.
Okay. So there you go. This House would ban makeup in middle schools.
Mark,
Who came up with that?
Well, it's easy because you
Are
don't.
you guys opposition?
Oh,
Yeah.
how much?
Jacob, do you want to
You
turn
guys
the
are-
camera on?
Proposition.
Proposition?
Already?